Thank you for coming back on time. My name's Viviana Muñoz. I coordinate the program on health, intellectual property, and biodiversity issues at the South Center, which is an intergovernmental organization of developing countries, for those that may not know about the South Center. And we are based in Geneva. And our role is really to support South-South cooperation and multilateral processes, the participation of developing countries. So really happy to have been in Pretoria and now here with you. I will present the panelists as we go through our program. So for this panel, you'll see we're in session 3. We're at a moment now of, as it's titled, taking stock, but really it's about trying to gather as much as possible inputs for what would be a progressive future copyright agenda that would focus on development, on diversity, broadly aligned to the public interest, while of course responding to the purpose that copyright law is meant to serve. So this has really been what's been discussed so far with so many different angles and perspectives. And one gap that clearly has been shown is that what's being discussed at the multilateral level and how multilateral international copyright treaties have advanced, both in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the World Intellectual Property Organization, has not received enough, it has not responded fully to the national context, in particular when we're talking about the African continent. So historically, those particular concerns and the kind of stakeholders that should be involved in developing international copyright law have not necessarily been present, or the voices have not been amplified as if we were starting today. So if we were starting today thinking about international copyright law, perhaps it would look differently. Now, secondly, of course, this is an area of domain that advances very quickly. I think that's been discussed, and it's been shown with so many examples that all of you have been bringing on your work, that's constantly evolving. So how can we provide the kind of impetus for driving that change, which has to do both with culture, with the new technology, with the different stakeholders that come up as well. We have different players, some that were never really involved in these issues, and then with the correlation with other laws, including on culture, traditional knowledge holders, etc. So as you see, the other line for this session has to do with how do we find a bit more coherence between the processes that happen domestically, so national level processes, and then how can that inform the regional discussions, debates, reforms. That's why we will talk in particular of the African ACFTA effort. So that's the Free Trade Area Agreement, which it's not obvious to many, but it does have also aspects of intellectual property, and perhaps even on other issues that were touched related to that, for example, in terms of culture and other aspects. So we'll be hearing about that. And then how can we link up more, in particular also through this kind of networks that are being created with this conference, to try to keep that discussion alive of, also informing each other. How can we have that constant deliberation between what are national reform processes or national context, what are the problems that are being, that are coming out, and sharing experiences also to inform the multilateral context. So for that, I'm going to start off just explaining again to the panelists. And so, these are not going to be long presentations. Basically, we're going to try to be building on a particular question that will be addressed for each one of you. So just, I would suggest just to focus first on that particular question. And as the discussion goes, we can just amplify and then come back to all of you so that we can be a bit more interactive conversation among the panel. And then, of course, there will be a moment when we can then open up for everyone as well. But we'll do it first with the panel, then with our discussants that you see that are here as well. And then we'll open up for the broader Q&A. So that is the plan. So I will start off with Vitor, who's a program officer at the South Center. He's also been supporting a lot of the processes logistically as well for the conference. Vitor, I won't talk about your particular, but he's really multidisciplinary. He started in anthropology, then did law, so he brings a lot to I think this discussion. So one of the issues, just to start us off, Vitor, is really how can we break down the silos between what we know is developments at the domestic level in national copyright with what is happening, these very lively debates on multilateral fora with regards to copyright. What can we do in particular to amplify the voices of African stakeholders?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a huge opportunity to be here with us. We have listened so much and learned so much. So in this short intervention, I wanted to focus on 4 points, focus basically on this interplay between the national, the regional, and the global. And because we have here a number of people coming from all the way down from Geneva and learning from the concrete experiences of researchers, universities, institutions, but also vice versa, how maybe that's also the opportunity to present a little bit of this aura of neutrality that is embedded in international policy making. I think it's important for us to really concretize that sort of interplay. So these 4 points, okay, I promise, they'll be as short as possible. So the first one is to acknowledge that there's a huge knowledge and participation gap in international multilateral fora. Meaning African scholars, researchers, individuals' interests are not well reflected. In fact, they're often dismissed. And that's obviously part of a structurally unequal system. And that means very concrete things. It means that there's limited financial resources to join the meetings, as we have discussed here, limited access to information in many ways. And of course, meetings like this, they precisely have this goal of narrowing that gap. And I think it's been very successful in that sense, but we cannot also miss the fact that we still need structural change and the benefit of developing countries in the global south. So the second point is that addressing copyright issues, and if we look broadly at everything that is taking place not only in Geneva but elsewhere, it doesn't focus exclusively at the World Intellectual Property Organization. And at the World Intellectual Property Organization, the WIPO, it doesn't focus exclusively at the so-called SCCR committee, the committee that deals with copyright and related rights. I just tried to list here a few examples of how you see copyright being dealt with across various topics and organizations. Moreover, there's also an overlap in terms of the strategies and the arguments. That's important because sometimes some delegations which have better financial capacity and more resources will be having a more comprehensive view of all of those. And perhaps we are missing out many opportunities by not understanding or reflecting on that interplay as well. So just a few examples. So at the discussions on traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, still at the WIPO, clearly there are interplays with copyright. You have copyright-based projects on a committee that finances development projects for specific countries, also at the WIPO. But at the World Health Organization, you have copyright-related aspects on digital health and research of different diseases. You have at the UNESCO level the recent approval of recommendations on open science. When you're going to ICANN and regulation of domain names, you have a strong overlap or sometimes an equivalence of arguments with copyright issues. When you're discussing telecommunications at the ITU, also in Geneva, there's a lot of overplay, as well as other committees. And at the WTO, the World Trade Organization level, at the TRIPS Council that specifically addresses intellectual property, there have been discussions such as on copyrights, exceptions and limitations in the digital environment. So I listed all of them just for us to have a sense of the fact that we need to have a very comprehensive view if we want to address the knowledge gap that I referred to. So the third point is that to do that, actually, and I think that's very clear from everyone who joined this conference, both in Pretoria and here, is that this interplay between the global, the regional, and national is not only very important, but African experiences, cases have a pivotal contribution to that. Again, I'm just going to mention 4 possibilities that I think we have discussed so far. So Professor Caroline Ncube will be talking about the IP protocol of the AFCFTA. I think there's a potential new paradigm in the making. Let's see. We have extensively discussed the Constitutional Court case in South Africa and the advocacy by Blind SA. It gives us a hint of the importance of national lawmaking towards global lawmaking similar perhaps to what we've seen in the access to medicines context, how the discussions that we've had, rich discussions here on legislative experiences, institutional setups in selected countries, they're very useful for other countries to mirror those processes, or at least to understand some of the main institutional pitfalls at the global level. And finally, how the concrete cases that we heard, it's not to be an utilitarian here, but then they're very useful in shaping the arguments of delegations in Geneva and really trying to make a more compelling argument that not only refers to broad problems, but really refers to real life experiences. The fourth point, and I'm concluding with that, is that despite everything, if we dismiss the structural pitfalls of the intellectual property system, then we're not going to get anywhere. And by saying this, I want to explicitly argue that just including more people doesn't mean that we're going to have more development-oriented solutions and conclusions anywhere. So more people doesn't mean necessarily more diversity. But all of those are obviously a prerequisite to that. So I think it's as the last point, it's important for us to imagine how to concretize those aspirations in a really progressive and public-oriented way. So thank you.
Thanks, Vitor. And when you say more development-oriented, we could say that's similar to saying in the public interest. So taking from that note, in order to understand more what is the public interest when we look at copyright law, we have our next speaker, Dr. Sanya Samtani, who's the SARChI Chair for International and Constitutional Law. And Dr. Sanya has been looking a lot at human rights law. So the question for her is, how can, in the African context, can we use more human rights instruments that have been so central and across many areas, from health, from education, and so forth? How can we use these instruments to strengthen the right to research, which we've talked a lot about these days, and the public interest more broadly within copyright law?
Thank you so much, Viviana. Just a small correction. I was a postdoctoral research fellow at the SARChI chair at the University of Pretoria. I'm now at the University of Witwatersrand at the Mandela Institute as a senior researcher. The Mandela Institute focuses on economic exclusion, and so that dovetails nicely with my research on copyright and human rights. So my research with regard to the Right to Research project focuses specifically on developing a right to research in international law. So really considering where in international law we can find this right, if at all it exists. Now, although much of the research on this issue emerges from an analysis of copyright exceptions, that's natural given how we've seen that copyright acts as a barrier to accessing and participating in research, it really becomes important to view research from outside the market paradigm, or the so-called knowledge economy created by copyright. As we heard from Professor Adam Haupt, knowledge is so much more than its commodification. Staying only in the copyright exceptions paradigm puts us on the back foot because we are always trying to justify that the defense applies. We often forget that copyright law does not operate in isolation. There are several intersecting legal regimes that all operate at the same time, in particular international human rights law, internationally, and constitutional law domestically. My research focuses on these intersecting regimes specifically. Now, it must be noted that these regimes impose obligations on states. So really when we're thinking about the public interest in the context of human rights law or in the context of constitutional law in a constitutional democracy like South Africa, we're thinking about the Bill of Rights. We're thinking about the state obligations that the Bill of Rights imposes. And so here the public interest is not just a developmental objective, it's something that has concrete obligations that are attached to it. And so states can be held accountable for failing to fulfill that. My research then goes on to really explain what these specific obligations are. But before I go into that, or I don't know if I'll get time to get into that, I just want to highlight how these intersecting legal regimes can help with policymaking on the international and regional levels, and specifically to foreground African voices. So on the international plane, international law applies, and so the rules on interpretation of treaties would apply. So the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties provides that set of rules. Now, applied to this context, the specific context of copyright and human rights, it requires that when interpreting states' copyright obligations, they are also required to consider other relevant international law, and that would be human rights law. Similarly, when interpreting human rights law, international human rights law, states are required to consider trade and copyright obligations that have a bearing on that. So that's the first way in which policymakers at all levels in all international organizations must consider the general impact of their state's cumulative obligations. Now, states' constitutions play a key role in how their international obligations are actually given effect to on the ground. And with copyright law, we see, especially in African countries, in South Asia as well, copyright law is an imported piece of legislation. It's not something that was developed from these countries. It was imposed. I think Viviana's telling me my time is almost up, so I'm going to proceed quickly. Thank you. So unlike international laws equivocating, like Vitor was talking about, the unequal international legal structures, constitutions in a constitutional democracy are the supreme law of the land. And so to the extent to which copyright is given effect to in statutory law, it must be interpreted in line with the Constitution. Now, that's what we saw with the blind essay decision, the groundbreaking blind essay constitutional court decision that we talked about in Pretoria. This also, in turn, helps shift the meaning of international law, because the Vienna Convention that I talked about also has a provision called a provision dealing with domestic subsequent practice. So this is one way in which, if we use African court decisions to build the nature of international law, that's already inbuilt in rules of interpretation. So we must do that more. And policymakers at all levels must take seriously constitutional court decisions and other court decisions from African countries and other countries in the global south. In my research, I identify an international legal human right to research located in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, the ICESCR, as I will call it, is one of the world's most widely ratified treaties. Let's look at the numbers. It has 171 states parties and 4 signatory states, including the US. Now, let's look at the WTO. The WTO has 160 member states, and I'm only counting states parties here because I'm not counting the autonomous territories or territories within states that are also parties, that are also members, and 24 observer states that are beginning their accession negotiations in due course. So if we do the math, the majority of the member states to the WTO bear concurrent obligations under the ICESCR, 142 common states parties. So there really is no excuse for states failing to take seriously their human rights obligations that bind them, even while considering their negotiations at the WTO as well as in other regional fora. So how can policymakers across the board use international human rights law or the international human right to research in their work? For example, they could make explicit reference to interpreting regional trade agreements in line with states' existing concurrent human rights obligations. That's one way of doing it. In particular, when dealing with international and regional negotiations on trade, copyright, and issues of intellectual property, and other issues related to the knowledge economy. There are other ways of also including it, particularly in domestic settings, in understanding the extent to which there's Bill of Rights impact on interpreting copyright law and other trade policy. And so those are the two main ways in which international and regional policymakers can use these intersecting regimes to foreground the human right to research. Now, I locate this right in Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And the more I present this work, it's a work in progress, the more I think of how all 3 parts of Article 15 are relevant to research. Not just the right to science, which is where I usually foreground it, but also the right to culture, because that's where we include indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge. And also, third, the right of authors to benefit from the protection of their moral and material interests. This has also been interpreted by UNESCO and other international human rights law bodies as a collective right. So really, all 3 parts of Article 15(1) are relevant to understanding the full scope of the right to research. There are a range of obligations of varying priority that states, parties to the ICESCR bear. And these obligations are those that are immediately realizable. So there's a range of obligations there. There are certain obligations of minimum core, which include the obligation not to discriminate against anyone on the basis of race, gender, disability, etc. And there are programmatic obligations which are future-looking. So there are, am I out of time? Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks. There are also, maybe in response to a question, I can explain what these obligations are. But I will also say that it's not only the obligations stemming from Article 15(1) that are relevant here. We have to consider how research is disseminated, how it's preserved, who funds that research. And so private parties and the state regulation of business activities is another important aspect to consider here. And states have obligations in this respect under the ICESCA as well. So I can talk about that a little bit more moving forward. But thank you so much, Viviana.
Thank you so much, Sanya. And you started off on that important point that clearly if we only look within copyright law for the solutions, we might be limiting the potential scope of interpretations we can find. So just following up on that, we have Professor Sean Flynn of American University Washington College of Law, and the big supporter for this conference. And now coming back, looking within copyright law, Sean, can you tell us a bit about what are the approaches that can be taken to enable preservation and uses for research materials?
Great. So thank you. And this has been a really exciting few days of discussions and having these kind of collaborations between the actual users, the researchers, the librarians, the preservers on the one side, the kind of lawyers and academics teasing out what some of the legal problems are. And then very exciting to have the government representatives, telling us what they're focused on, what they're doing, and what they might want to do, and some of this can be focusing on what kind of things can we all do to address some of these problems. So we've talked about two big fields, two big problems in two big fields. So we've talked about researchers that need to use materials now, especially modern digital research methods that use materials in different ways than many of our laws were imagining when they were being written 40 years ago, right? The imagination at that time was a researcher walks into a library and they copy an article from a book on a Xerox machine. And some of our laws, not so much in Africa, but in some places, literally say, make a single copy on a Xerox machine. They say photocopy instead of Xerox. It's not branded. But literally, I'm reading one in front of me right now. I won't tell you the country, but it's not in Africa. That a reprographic reproduction, you can use a single copy of a work by photocopy facilities. So when do we do that, Very rarely anymore, right? Now we're digitizing, we're saving things in the cloud, we're saving things on our computers, etc. So one issue, the researchers, and then the preservation, right? Similar. So sometimes we have laws that say you can preserve a single copy in the same form as the original, which means if it was a book, you can create a book, but you can't digitize it then. So the problem that we're seeing is these laws that are like stuck in the past and are not fit for the future, right? And so that's the desire, the need to have flexibility. So that's one problem. It's insufficient flexibility, perhaps, in our laws. But then another problem could be you have a flexible law and there could be insufficient certainty. And so we've heard that, some places here. I think John at one point says, well, we've got a general exception now in Nigeria's law, but we didn't mention text and data mining. Well, that could be a problem, maybe not, but the flexibility is there, but are the researchers going to see it? The flexibility might be there in a preservation example, but are the preservers going to see it? Okay, so models that we've talked about in this conference, literally wrote this today because these ideas are coming up, but models that we've been talking about, different speakers at this conference to deal with these problems. So one, high level, the international solution. Many of our laws are shaped by the international system. And so when the international system changes, and sometimes, unfortunately, it requires the international system to change in order for us to change our own laws. An example is the Marrakesh Treaty. None of us were against exceptions for disabilities, but until we had an obligation to do it, we weren't going back to our laws to change them. So we could create obligations on the international sphere. The complication over on the right-hand side is you're only going to get really broad consensus there. You're not going to be able to tackle controversial issues within an international treaty. So you're going to get a minimum standard. So maybe you could accomplish an international treaty standard for non-commercial research activities or something, but you might not get the full scope of what you actually might want in your local law, which might be context specific. You might actually want to be a little different than Europe might want you to be, right? So you can move down. So you can do your own domestic legislative form where you're going to have a lot more flexibility. And then you have that choice between, do I go flexible or do I go clear, or do I do both? And that's the magic of the fair use terms such as, because you can go flexible, but then after the such as, you can be specific. So it's okay to use, it's not a violation to use a copyrighted work for the purpose of research, such as in informational analysis or computational analysis or whatever. So you're not restricting yourself to that, but you're clarifying it. And there's larger opportunities there. So guidelines and interpretations, moving down. Maybe your law is flexible enough. Maybe you don't have a clear barrier, but it might not be, the librarians or the researchers or whatever might not be able to see themselves. So what can you do then? Then you could have guidelines and interpretations. So we heard from Kenya that they do this. They issue interpretations. And it's not law, but it's going to give a very clear form of guidance to those users that, okay, now we think we can do it. So you could do that for preservation. You could do that for research. You could say when the law says make a copy, it means digitization is okay. Yeah, we wrote it in the 1970s. We haven't amended it yet, but we're going to give a pro-human rights interpretation, right? We're going to interpret it to promote the right to education, to promote the right to science, to promote the right to access to information. And we're going to take some of those terms and we're going to broaden them through interpretation. We think that it means that you can go forward, right? And those interpretations could happen at the international level. They could happen at domestic level. They can also happen, I mentioned at the last conference, just private ordering. So users themselves can get together and say, here's what we think is rational practice in our own communities. And we've done this a bunch of times in the United States, and usually it prevents all kinds of disputes and litigation from happening. And in a couple times where litigation has happened, the courts have actually looked at those statements and said, that seems reasonable, we're going to go with that. And they use it to interpret the fairness of certain practices. We've mentioned some opportunities for litigation. So Blind South Africa, for instance, has achieved, they were waiting for so long, they said, we're not waiting anymore, we're going to the courts. Copyright Amendment Bill in South Africa is still going on, but there is a right for people with disabilities now because they pushed it through. And the complications with litigation is that it's going to be case by case. You're not going to be able to achieve a broad general norm generally through litigation, but it may point that way to say there is some openness and the courts may decide that way. And then finally, advice. So many of us, educators in the room, we could have, I suggest that we have a network of legal clinics to help on those case-by-case decisions and maybe give some advice to both users, but also to creatives too. There's all these questions come up every time I travel around between how do I get paid and where's my rights to remuneration and how do these collective management organizations work and things like that. And these are things that actually students could work on because the questions and the answers repeat. So it might be areas where we could build some teaching programs and some advice programs to help people on an individual basis. So I'll stop there, throw those out for thought.
Thank you, Sean, for so succinctly bringing us to the schematics of all the entry points that we can see from copyright law to enable, I think, beyond the preservation and use of research materials, but overall, how to tackle some of the problems when they come up and where the questions are not readily available. So now just looking at, again, if we did not have now the context of knowledge creation being transnational and access to materials, to technology, necessarily going beyond national borders, then because of this, we have to look at the multilateral context. So looking specifically at WIPO, we have many of you involved here, and two of our panelists, both Dick and Teresa, have been involved a lot for a long time, particularly on issues of copyright, and really helping bring the interest of people with visually impaired disabilities and libraries, just the broader educational community. and these particular needs for preservation, cross-border uses, etc. So we have Dick and Teresa. Dick is you've heard him already before today, in School of Information Science, University of South California. Sorry? Oh, Carolina. Did I say what did I say? Sorry. South Carolina. And Teresa Hackett, Copyright and Libraries Program Manager of Electronic Information for Libraries. Teresa and Dick, in the order you wish and how you wish, if you could generally tell us a bit more, and we've gone a little bit here and there during the conference about the processes that you consider are most relevant that are happening now in the World Intellectual Property Organization, particularly the SECR, but perhaps also just to mention perhaps some future avenues of what can be done and how the African group, again, is helping to shape this process.
Thank you very much. There's an ongoing litigation between University of South Carolina and University of Southern California over the use of, so we tend not to, yeah, we have to get those names right. Thank you so much. Listening to the panel, obviously it's clear that there are different levels of norm setting. Certainly international level is one of those important spaces where we can resolve these issues, and WIPO is one of those places where we've been actively involved to try to address some of the IP issues in different areas. WIPO is a complex organization. There are different spaces and ways to engage in this space. It organized along committees, but also within the Secretariat, there are different places where different IP issues are addressed. Going back to Sean's table, you saw that one of the space that is mentioned is the committee, Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights. That has been very important in the most recent past in terms of norm setting, because a number of key issues that we are talking about today have been discussed. So issues like the Marrakesh Treaty, which we are trying to implement across the board. And most recently on the agenda is the issue of limitations and exceptions. But that's not the only space. There's a Committee on Development, CDIP, which is also very important. It tends to focus on the development agenda, which originated in the early 2000s. So that is important because it tends to focus on specific projects, implementation of projects. What I can say as one of the experts that has been involved in some of these projects is this underrepresentation of African projects are coming out of this committee. So it's very important that as Africans, we take advantage of these resources. Some of these are technical support to IP offices or research that provide specific recommendations for different areas of IP and not limited to copyright. Finally, IGC is extremely important to us in Africa, focuses on cultural resources, protection of cultural resources and expressive forms. Africa has taken a central role in this committee for the simple reason that obviously we have an vested interest in protecting our expressive forms. When you think about all these forums, there are opportunities to engage, to shape and influence international norm setting. I'll end by specifically mentioning that, of course, going back to SECR, one of the key issues there right now is the work program, which has been put forward by the African group and the African Union, which identifies some of the key issues that we need to address within the context of limitations and exceptions. I want to specifically highlight, going back to the conversation this morning, the issue of preservation, specifically digital preservation. So there's a toolkit that has been developed and will be presented at the next meeting of SCCR. That is critically important to the work of culture institutions, certainly to Africa, where we are grappling with ways in which to preserve our cultural resources. And I'll invite my colleague to speak about that toolkit.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Dick. And I should also mention that the that the SCCR over the last 15 years has been incredibly active in the area of limitations and exceptions since the agenda item first became a standing permanent item on the agenda. And the committee has commissioned a ton of studies on limitations and exceptions, and they're a really great resource for scholars and for anybody who's interested in this area and who wishes to map out trends and developments across the world. And in fact, Sean's institution has made use, and his students have made use of those resources to develop the work on the text and data mining and the research exceptions. So there are studies on education, on libraries, archives and museums, on technological protection measures, blind and visually impaired. So there's a whole lot of really good resources there. There's also been many proposals by member states, including the African group that made one of the early proposals for a treaty on limitations and exceptions, which covered all of the areas, so libraries, education, people with disabilities. And then eventually, as the negotiations moved through, the issue of limitations and exceptions for blind and visually impaired people became the focus, and that eventually became the Marrakesh Treaty. But in addition to that big treaty proposal in 2011, there have been a lot of other more recent specific proposals by individual member states, including from across the world, so including many countries in Latin America, from India, and then from individual African countries as well. So there's a really rich body of work there, which I think is very important for the context here. And then specifically on the most recent proposal by the African group for a work program on limitations and exceptions that Dick has just described, one of the elements of that work plan was to develop a toolkit on preservation, so the topic we were discussing this morning. And the overall objective of the toolkit is to make progress on the topic of limitations and exceptions at the SCCR. And in 2019, preservation emerged as a consensus issue during a series of 3 regional seminars organized by WIPO in Singapore, that was for the APC region, the Asia Pacific region, in Santo Domingo for GRULAC, Latin American region, and in Nairobi, excuse me, which was for the African group region. And this toolkit is intended as a new WIPO-endorsed resource to assist legislators in devising and revising their national copyright legislation. And I think that's important that it is a WIPO-endorsed resource, because then that gives it a wide credibility among member states and legislators and other stakeholders as well. Now, this toolkit on preservation has just been published on the WIPO website about 2 weeks ago, I think it was, and it will be presented to member states at the next session of the SCCR, which takes place in Geneva from March 13th to March 17th. The toolkit covers issues such as technological and format neutrality, a little bit we touched on that this morning, proactive and anticipatory preservation, shared and split collections, cooperative preservation programs amongst the GLAMs, that's the GLAMs, galleries, libraries, archives and museums, and rights metadata, very important for discoverability of preserved materials online. And then it sets out specifically options for who may use the exception, what works may be used, why may these works be used, and how those works will be used. Overall, I think from our perspective, the perspective of the library and archives communities, the toolkit will highlight the topic of preservation of cultural heritage as a priority issue. It will also provide useful guidance to member states when they're reviewing their legislation. However, it doesn't address the important topic of access to preserved issues that we talked about this morning. But the Secretariat is committed to developing a toolkit, a separate toolkit on access for preservation. So we, in our statements at the SCCR and in our interventions, we will be urging that work on this access piece is done as soon as possible. Because, as I said this morning, there is really no point in preserving if the preserved materials are not available to the researchers, to the scholars, and to the communities about whom these materials relate. So we're looking forward to the discussions on the toolkit, preservation toolkit at the SCCR. We encourage you to tune in online to those discussions. All the SCCR meetings, the WIPO meetings are available online. They're streamed, you just can simply log in online, or if you want to, or you can participate as an observer if you are registered with a registered observer. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you, Teresa. Shall we also give a clap? We're doing. And I think the invitation has already been made prior to say, please, as far as you can, engage in the process. This network helps you to know some of the people who are involved. There's a lot of resources already on the agenda, as you said, but a lot of them are not coming from the experiences and the cases from the African continent. So if you are doing research, or you can share this, you can do it directly through that process, or else even South Center, we always publish works, articles from developing country scholars. So feel free to send us something you have that you think it's important to get noticed in this kind of Geneva environment. We'd be happy to publish that as well. I'd like now to invite our reflection with regards to the process of how to strengthen the trade environment in the African context. And so copyright law happens to be one of the issues among many that sparked interest between high-level officials when thinking about how to strengthen the free trade in Africa, and that has significant consequences. So to tell us a bit about that process and how IP generally and copyright specifically are being framed within this discussion and where that text is, we have Professor Carolyn Ncube, who has been assisting in this process since the inception of the drafts. She is a research chair on intellectual property, innovation, and development at the University of Cape Town. And I did not mention which are the acronyms, but Carolyn, please feel free to describe for us further. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you all and very pleased to be sitting with all of my friends and colleagues up here. So I did prepare some thoughts about how to answer this question, and specifically to think about or to talk about what the objectives are of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and specifically those that pertain to intellectual property. But having listened to all of this amazing stuff that my co-panelists have been sharing, I wanted to perhaps start there, just try and link in what I want to say with what they've been saying. And I forgot to start my own timer, so Viviana doesn't have to nudge me. Done. Okay, so, we've heard quite a bit about the complexity and the difficulties that occur when we think about norm setting internationally. So I'm actually going to quote my co-panelists. So Vitor spoke a bit about structural issues. He spoke about a knowledge and participation gap, for example. And when you opened the session, Viviana, you spoke about the amplification of voices. So I think the fact that intellectual property is being thought of, discussed on a continental level, in terms of an FTA on the continent, actually speaks to some of those issues, right? So the structural problems that we face internationally on our own turf should be null, right? Null and void, they shouldn't exist. The lack of foregrounding of African voices shouldn't be a matter to think about it all. This is an African instrument, and these are the only voices that should be speaking loud and clear. And so this is why I think it's really important that this is happening on the continent. I think it was Vitor again who spoke about how there's this interplay between the national, the regional, and the continental and the global, right? And again, we have problems there. So we find that there are many moving parts, and there's often not enough capacity for African states to keep up with all of these agencies and what they're doing on all of the programs. It's all a haze, okay? Not so any longer. On the continent, we have the clearest glasses ever, right? There shouldn't be a haze. So that's another reason why I think it's really important. And Sanya spoke about how a lot of our copyright law was imposed on African states. They didn't have the benefit of policy formulation before, they didn't have a choice. These are the laws. And many of our states have continued with those laws. And so what this does, this process of drafting an IP protocol under the AFCFTA agreement actually calls for pause, allows African states to finally stop and actually think about their policy direction that they want then to implement in all of these interesting law reform processes going forward. So it's really important, and I thought I'd start by speaking to that. And in the 2 minutes, 47 seconds I have left, let me answer the question. What are the objectives then of the IP protocol within the AFCFTA agreement? The answer to that is a very long one. I thought that I could perhaps whittled it down to 2 words, and I wrote here coherence, and I'm sure I wrote cohesion somewhere, but if you see my notebook, it's very interesting at this stage. But anyway, so it was context and coherence. So the context that I wanted to emphasize was that, first of all, the IP protocol is part, of course, of a trade agreement, right? So its objectives clearly flow from the mother agreement, right, where it flows from. So we know that the agreement itself, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, one of its objectives, in fact, I think its biggest objective, is to create a single market for goods and services in order to deepen economic integration on the African continent and in accordance with Agenda 2063. I skipped some words intentionally. What I wanted to emphasize was the Agenda 2063. We know that that is the developmental blueprint for the continent. And so immediately you see that broad objective is infused with a developmental perspective, right? So I would say that's the first thing. It's a free trade area agreement, but very clearly and strongly infused by developmental aspects. That agreement then has got specific objectives. And one of those specific objectives is to cooperate on investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policy. And then it is from that you get the mandate to negotiate the protocols on each of these areas. And that's really what I wanted to speak about and finish off. So then what would be the objective of the IP protocol? Well, it is to further the objectives of the main agreement from which it flows. And then, of course, it then would have its own self-propelling objectives. And where do those come from? This is where the interplay comes back again, right? So African states have been very strong despite the structural and other difficulties that they face in global norm setting, but they've been very strong in their perspectives. And so I, for one, would expect that those positions that they've been taking globally, pushing a particular work program at the SCCR, that needs to be reflected here. I mean, you can only speak with one voice, right? Like, double speak doesn't work. So I would expect that those objectives would be then infused into the IP protocol. And then where else could we find our objectives from? We would also find them from the national sphere. And I was joining remotely some of the discussions up in Pretoria, where we had that there's lots of exciting law reform in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, who else was doing reform? Nigeria, of course, they're on the cusp, Uganda, South Africa, slowly but hopefully surely. And so all of that as well should somehow be brought to play on the continental level in the IP protocol. So these objectives come from a multiplicity of sources, but I think they should all come together. And the very last thing, because my own timer has gone off, is credibility. I think we have a credibility crisis. So Teresa was saying to us, there will be a guide, a toolkit that's WIPO endorsed, and that's really good. I mean, our states seem to like something that's WIPO endorsed. And I'm thinking, why? Like, that's a credibility crisis. Why can't we do our own stuff, right? So I'm thinking that perhaps this protocol and this process is going to resolve some of the credibility insecurities that we have on the continent.
Thank you so much to Professor Ncube. And as you said, it's not an agenda of trade for trade, as has been for so many multilateral discussions, but it's really related to 2063 agenda, which is really empowerment for Africa. So good contextualization. Now, I'd like to invite Professor Desmond Oriakhogba from the University of Venda to bring us on the focus about what's happening in digital transformation in the African context, and in particular, how would the right approach to recognizing the right to research help leverage what's already happening that's exciting on digital transformation, but really lead us to ensure that that's also diversified and with an African perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, I'm still a senior lecturer, actually. I'm not yet a professor. And I will not pretend to be one. Okay, but just to quickly say that I would take us back again to think from a human rights perspective. You know, Sanya, Dr. Sanya led that, and I'm still taking us back there. And the thing about speaking last is that somebody would have said things that you build upon. And so thank you, Dr. Sanya, for the background work you've done. It has made my work so easy. But quickly to answer the question, I will say that the right to research will actually contribute to achieving the objectives of the African Union Digital Transformation Strategy by offering a flexible, incentive-based and comprehensive framework for actualizing those objectives. And how will this be done? The right to research actually confers a positive right of access to researchers. And of course, again, it allows researchers as authors, and here authors, I define them to include indigenous communities, to actually derive moral and material benefits from their creativity, and for indigenous communities, obviously, for their cultural creativity. Then, of course, comprehensive, because it will impose a duty on states to, not to take measures that will not hinder the actualization of that positive right of access for researchers and the right of researchers as authors to derive benefit from their creativity. And it's not just going to impose such duties on states, but it's also going to impose the duty on non-state actors like the big corporations, operating in the publishing space. If time permits, I will adumbrate further on these three key elements of the right to research. But just let me quickly state here that the African Digital Transformation Strategy, as we know, was adopted in 2020 by the AU, and it sets out policy directions with the overarching objective of harnessing digital technologies and innovation, and also taking advantage of Africa's digital economy for achieving the broad developmental aspirations that are set out in the African Union Agenda 2063. Now, in the digital transformation strategy, AI research, AI development, AI deployment is recognized and acknowledged as very instrumental to realizing the objectives of the strategy. And the framers of that strategy also recognize the importance of the important role that a flexible, incentive-based and comprehensive legal regime can play to enable AI research and development for Africa's digital transformation. Now, Dr. Renz, I'm sure, would have told us a lot about the challenges that copyright actually pose to AI research and all. And in fact, for those of us who were in Pretoria, we had some practical examples coming from AI researchers on the ground. I mean, African AI researchers, about the challenges they face to access information, to access data, especially data that are copyright protected. So to overcome this challenge and I strongly believe, and as my research is trying to show, to demonstrate, is that we should then look outside copyright, because copyright will not offer that flexible, comprehensive, and incentive-based framework. Because, of course, yes, there's there's room for incentivization under copyright regime. But as we all know, and as research has shown, the copyright regime is not flexible enough, because yes, there are exceptions and limitations which some have regarded as user rights, but the user rights are not positive in nature, so that researchers cannot really lay claim. So what I'm saying is that the right to research, will help to provide that flexible framework for Africa's digital transformation. Now, the right to research can be, as Dr. Samtani noted, can actually be implied from the right to science and culture, recognized under Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But there are other rights too, like the right to education, the right to freedom of expression, and the right to property, from which the right to research, especially when we look at the right to research as offering that flexible, incentive-based, and comprehensive framework, from which the right to research can be, implied. And I also believe strongly that the right to research, apart from being capable of being implied, can actually be framed as a standalone and explicit right. In fact, I think that will make more impact, and there are realities, there are African realities, there are circumstances, peculiarities within our African context that makes such a case strong. For instance, as I'm sure most of us already know, we still continue to face the problem of access to knowledge for research and education. We continue to face persistent and continuous lobbying by international corporations and governments against copyright reform in Africa. Also, we still continue to hear and live with the precarious and very penurious condition that African authors face. And of course, we're still talking about at international fora, at national levels, even at regional levels, there is still conversations around the need to protect indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage, and and I think that the right to research, because of those key elements that it offers, can actually help to address these issues. All right, so just to emphasize again that the right to research is important to achieving Africa's digital transformation strategy, simply because it offers a flexible, incentive-based, and comprehensive framework, for knowledge access and knowledge governance. I can explain further in the question and answer sections. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Desmond. And in the digital transformation, of course, the law is always going to be behind trying to catch up. And hopefully, yeah, it's more helpful than a hindrance, as you mentioned. We have now our gracious hosts for today and tomorrow also as discussants. So we have colleagues from the research IP unit at the Faculty of Law here at the University of Cape Town. So I'd like to invite Hananai, Hlomanu, and Professor Tobias Schonwetter. First to Hananai, if you'd like to reflect on some of the themes that you've heard on this session, and being from the IP unit, your reflections about what's been mentioned in terms of the scope of what copyright law may or may not achieve. So.
Okay, so I was just asked to go first, so I shall do that, even though I don't want to say I missed half of the session because I had to deal with the DJ issues outside in the meantime, but I'll try to reflect in as much as I can on some of the things that I heard and that I found useful. So first of all, thanks to all the speakers. That was a nice kind of end to a day of very interesting proceedings. And for me, it's interesting as a host, because normally I stand in this venue as someone, in the best of cases, imparting knowledge to others. And I really benefited from all the knowledge that was imparted on me today, and I learned a lot, and that was certainly very, very nice for a change. So not sure whether this is a critical comment, but it's maybe a bit of food for thought maybe for the panelists to pick up on or not. But the one thing that that I may have heard is that if only given the opportunity, then there was a great chance that we in Africa would kind of be better able to pursue our objectives on the global copyright kind of space. But from my experiences, really limited as they are, but also as part of being a part of the Open Air Research Network, it is a little bit more complicated than this still on our continent. And that is because just Africa continues to be not just one country, even though we are moving toward that kind of one big instrument that Caroline was talking about. But we differ still very much in many ways in terms of state of development and all sorts of other things, and also in terms of different colonial histories. And these have resulted in very different attitudes towards copyright protection and why we have copyright in the first place. So, and as much as I would like us all in Africa to have the same kind of utilitarian, public interest-oriented approach to copyright law and policymaking, I just know that this is a harder sell in some countries of Africa than it is in others, and especially those countries that have a French colonial history, I suppose, where that copyright as a private right is still a very powerful narrative. And I'm saying this partly out of frustration, because I've been in meetings where we all entered in one room and I was kind of thinking we were all on the same page as in terms of how useful access to knowledge can be for advancing developmental objectives. And it took us quite a while to actually kind of, before we realized, and we're really coming from two very different starting points. Now, this was a negative part of that, but the positive spin on this is then obviously linked to what Caroline was speaking about, and this is that I'm, especially because of this, so excited about this IP protocol, even though I haven't seen it. I saw an early draft, but to what extent this will materialize or not is a complete different question. But this is, in my opinion, now this much needed opportunity for African countries to develop this kind of own unified voice in this space, which we then can, going forward, pursue at these international fora. Having said this, though, we must also be realistic. It will be, and I'm sure Caroline said this, even though I was probably outside, it will be an instrument of compromise, and there will be things in there that will disappoint us. So I'm trying to also not keep my hopes too high up, because there will be counter arguments being taken into account to what we typically put onto the table with what we stand for. So there will be stuff in there that we don't like. That is my main comment. But because the word multidisciplinarity came up or was described by several of the speakers, I just want to add my word of support here, that I think this is a key issue, that we just need to really stop thinking as copyright as just a singular issue, and we try to find solutions to the problems that we are seeing within copyright. The answers often lie outside. That's not to say that we should forget about copyright, of course, but we definitely need to connect the dots, because otherwise we really are at a risk here of missing the boat. I wanted to jot down a couple of more comments about my frustration that still the WTO is often the main kind of vehicle for discussing copyright issues, which I think from the outset is the wrong kind of fora for obvious reasons anyways. I wanted to lend support to how important WIPO's role is because of that, and that it's good time now to actually also revisit the development agenda, which was also mentioned, but I think I'm going to stop here, because otherwise we are at serious risk of running over time. I hope this is helpful and was what you had in mind when you asked me for comments here. Thank you.
I'm not going to talk a lot, just to say that Tobias took most of my ideas, so I'm not really going to go back into all of that. Thank you very much to all the speakers today. Very, very profound findings and thoughts. For me today, really, the one thing that stood out for me, and something that has been at the back of my mind a lot, especially because of kind of the research that I do, is that a lot of our current laws are playing catch up to technological advancements. And so the one thing that stuck out for me, especially at this moment, and I'm probably going to pose it as a question at the end of the day, so anybody can feel free to tackle it. One of the things was that we mentioned that copyright law, as it sits in most countries in Africa at the moment, these laws are laws that were inherited. And a lot of the time they do not represent what it is that we aspire to do or what to have. And so without really trying to bring in another dimension to the whole copyright catching up dimension really is, at what point do you feel that we have to start taking seriously these decolonization of copyright chats? Because for me at this moment, even if we try to amend and to add new clauses in this and that and have all these debates, at the end of the day, if the copyright law itself was not made by African people for Africa to begin with, how effective will it be at the end of the day? And so maybe, like I said, it's probably more of a question, really, more than anything, to say, are we thinking, are we actually starting off at the correct point? Is this something that can be undone? Or are we just at the mercy of whoever else was, clever enough, I guess, to begin these conversations? So thank you for that. And I think maybe it's just a parting thought that I'm going to leave you with. If it's a question that anybody wants to answer, I'm keen to get those thoughts. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you for those rich thoughts. We're going to take questions in a minute. We're just going to finish with our discussants first. So we will then open up. And that's why we had that first short intervention by all the panelists so that we can ensure that you can all engage. So just wait for that. It's coming. That said, I'd like to now pass on the floor to Professor Jeremy De Beer of the University of Ottawa, Center of Law, Technology, and Society. Again, another broad perspective on the right to research, but as well as with a lot of experience working with different researchers, including from the African continent. So Jeremy, to you, if you can also reflect on what you've heard and perhaps.
Oh, thank you so much, Viviana. I don't mean to overrule you as the moderator and chair, but I'd like to invite my friend to make a comment here first. She's been very excited. So I'll hear from her, and then if I have anything to add.
Thank you so much, sir, for the respect and love that you've shown me. My comment is going to be kind of emotional, and I hope that I'm not getting into people's emotions a lot, but we need to say these things, especially as Africans, especially when we speak of Africa as a continent and how we've been seen and perceived by society for all these centuries that we've been perceived. I'm hoping that at some point, when we discussing policy and law, it's not just going to be about Africa, Europe. We're going to understand that we are all one human race. And we need to love and respect each other because we are human race. We are all spirits having a human experience beyond gender, beyond race, beyond age, and everything else that everyone has been trying to put in that cage of. So my comment is going to be, I want to appreciate this process because it's a very important process that we're having as humanity, not just as Africans, but as humanity. And I'm hoping that the policymakers, the politicians, the legal experts, the educators have to come to that understanding that whatever we need to do, it has to go back to that understanding that we are all human. Education, I believe, we all don't understand what that is. Just because I didn't go to school, I didn't go to university, does not mean I'm not educated. As an African child, I get educated. I'm a traditional healer. I didn't need to go to a medical school to get educated in terms of health. My education is beyond what everybody understands and what people know in terms of the system that we are all enduring, which is patriarchy and capitalism. And I'm hoping that as we're sitting here, we dig deeper than the fact that we think we know because we've studied books. We understand what the books are saying. there's more to life than what we think it is. And I'm hoping that as people that are in power right now, the so-called power, not necessarily power, but the so-called power that the system is giving, that we are able to really decolonize. We need to understand this word decolonization. It's beyond just the books that you guys are reading. So we really need to make sure that we go deeper. Let's go deeper, so that at the end of the day, we leave a legacy for generations to come where they can be able to human with each other and be in love and peace. And I believe that copyright reform, it is the basic of that in our society, because it's about knowledge and information, first thing and foremost. So how are we making sure that we give policies that are going to give future generations to be able to access knowledge and information without isolating each other? And I will leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Anything that I have to say will be, I think, much less important and possibly less interesting. But I was listening to this panel. Thank you very much for the insights. I always learn so much listening to my friends. And Dr. Gray before lunch. And there's an issue that impacts science and creativity and innovation and the right to research that I worry we may not be alert to, because the developments aren't happening in Geneva at WIPO or the WTO. But these developments have major implications for the digitization of genetic resources. There are developments happening right now at WHO under the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework for governing what at WHO is called gene sequence data, virus gene sequences in particular. That's what Dr. Gray was talking about. But a very similar debate is happening right now at the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is based in Montreal. And we are on the cusp of a new entrenched governance regime for what at CBD is called DSI, Digital Sequence Information. And that is going to construct the intellectual property related rules governing all digitized genetic resources for every form of life on Earth. This will revolutionize science and technology. The old system was predicated on the exchange of tangible samples of plants and animals. And our entire system of access and benefit sharing for indigenous peoples and local communities, prior informed consent, all of those principles are based on the exchange of tangible embodiments of genetic resources. But that's not what happens anymore. What's exchanged is digital information about gene sequences. So this system is being entrenched as we speak. And a very similar developments occurring at the Food and Agriculture Organization, the Plant Treaty, International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. It's a very important issue for all countries, but African countries in particular, to pay attention to. And that system has a global multilateral benefit sharing system that supports open access to plants' genetic resources. That is going to be reevaluated and reconsidered. So in all of these areas, I think we may not be attuned to significant issues that are going to affect science and technology research and transformations as we move to digitized genetic resources. My friend, Prof. Chidi Agwamanam, and I have been working a lot on these issues, starting to raise some awareness. The core point that we've been trying to articulate is that open is not enough. We can open up access to these resources, but that is likely to exacerbate, not ameliorate inequality, because the greatest beneficiaries of unfettered open access to these resources will be those who already have the power and the tools to exploit them. And so I think this is an issue that I would encourage this community to really pay attention to. Thank you for the opportunity to share that.
Thank you. For final discussant, just like to hand to Professor Alan Rocha from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro.
Okay, this has been a very, very rich panel. Actually, the whole event has been very, very rich, and I've learned a lot. I don't want to go out. Don't want to leave. I want to stay here in Africa. I have a lot more to learn here than back in Brazil. But I'll do just a few considerations. One of them is that two things. One, I think we should focus less on changing the legislation and focus more on changing the practices. And that means also creating possibilities of the institutions, deliberating institutional policies, of the countries sharing experiences, how to go around, how unite the countries against the same right holders, which the arguments in the South Africa case are the same arguments they've used in Brazil, the same arguments they've used in other places. That means changing our view from being right holder-centered copyright bill to seeing it as a more holistic, from a more holistic perspective. What do I mean by that? Is that a lot of the limitations can enter the copyright, can affect copyright if they come from outside of copyright. I'll give an example of preservation. Preservation is not a copyright issue per se. It's much more a cultural heritage issue. It's much more a cultural rights issue, much more a human rights issue. And it does have a side effect on copyright. So if we focus and deepen our discussions on how preservation is part of this other right, which will at some point overlap with copyright, but copyright right will be seen as much more minimal than it is. But we are looking at all issues from a copyright perspective, from a perspective of a copyright holder's standard. So that's why we are running a lot in circles. We could advance a lot if we take a view of copyright from outside of copyright. And that means human rights, that means other rights. You structure those rights and then bring them to copyright. Okay, there will be a side effect on copyright, but that's just a side effect. There is nothing that say the preservation is a right holder's right. So we're giving too much force, it's strengthening too much the rights of the right holders. We are falling into that discourse. And I think we need to change that a bit. And if we look at it from a different perspective, from outside, from without, in, we'll gain much more ground than the ones we are gaining now. One example is competition law and patents. That's an example of an outside thinking that was brought into an IP system and actually helped a lot to open it up. So I think we should also work on doing the same in terms of copyright. So besides that, plus institutional policies, for example, UCP could actually create a policy that would allow all the libraries to digitalize everything. And let's wait for the right holders to sue and see what they're going to do about it. And they are going to have the duty to do so. That happened, for example, in 3 universities in Brazil, the federal one, USP and Unicamp. The collective managed for reproductive rights, they entered there, they cut some material, and they said, you can't copy anything. What the institutions did, in 3 days, which never happens in Brazil, it takes like forever to have a policy. In 3 days, they had a policy saying that you could digitalize and you could share, and if the book's out of print, you could like digitalize and give it to students. What happened? They never got sued. So that started being done, and they never got sued. So there are examples like that. So I think we should not stop fighting for copyright law change, but also fight from other grounds as well. So I think that's what I had to say.
So thank you all for that, let's say, first round of panelists and discussants and other comments. We do still have more time now for any comments and questions of others. So just feel free, and we'll start. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vivian, and thank you to you, our presenters. Indeed, we need to speak one voice. I would like to mention that as we put effort in amplifying the voices of IP in the different spaces that we influence, we also need to recognize the past and the current efforts that have been made on the African continent. I did not hear anything on the African Regional Intellectual Property Organization that was set up by the Lusaka Agreement of 1976. and it has 22 member states so far, and also the sister agency, which is OAPI, the French-speaking, Francophone, the French-speaking equivalent. And they have set protocols that have been moving us as member states for years. The protocols do with trademarks, protocols do with patents, utility models and designs, the Harare Protocol, the Banjul Protocol. Then we have the strategic plans there under the Harare Strategic Plan, the Nairobi Strategic Plan, and all the treaties that come around them. And recently they came up with strategic plans for copyright, but also protocols on copyright and related rights, including the collective management guidelines, the cultural expressions, the Swankopon Protocol on traditional knowledge and expressions. All these protocols have been efforts and enabling the few African member states to be on board and to shape their landscape with the efforts, of course, of our mother agency, organization, which is the WIPO, that has done amazing, amazing work. So we need to recognize that, because if we come here and discuss and do not touch those efforts, it's like we are starting from scratch. And I like the expressions of Professor Caroline and Professor Tobias on after. I mean, these are all efforts by Africa to get on board. But I see that there's likely to be duplicity. The cost of doing business in terms of intellectual property may be increased if we do not harmonize and consolidate the efforts. So we'll find ourselves in a situation where we are speaking so many voices, not one voice. And there's need for consolidation, and I think Professor Caroline emphasized this, and Dr. Professor Kawooya and Teresa. Let's come together and consolidate the efforts and see how we can have direction. Otherwise, we'll be going to different spaces, and even the influencers and the helpers and the funders will take advantage of the different voices that we have at the continental level. In fact, we could even think of how to merge all these efforts in one basket and see how to take on the leadership rather than having these scattered different visions. So my question will be, are we as African states looking at the same vision as far as intellectual property is concerned, or we are chasing our small different visions in the different spaces that we are? The second one is about policies. The efforts do with national policies, and I'm glad that Professor Alan also mentioned this on the matter, on the issue concerning policies. We want to see, yes, intellectual property policies enhanced at national levels. How many of our countries have national intellectual property policies, apart from the laws? And Professor Alan is also emphasizing, we may not have, not everything requires a legal medicine or can be cured by the law. We can have other interventions. And so we need to look at this policy space. If we did a baseline, how many countries in Africa have national intellectual property policies? Let's take it further to the research and development institutions and universities. How many universities have intellectual property policies that can help us to amplify this message and the voice? I also wanted to hear something on enforcement. Yes, we are looking at inputs in terms of the knowledge inputs, but we have the knowledge products that are being infringed. The enforcement efforts at the World Intellectual Property Organization level, the efforts at national levels, and how can we merge and see how to fight piracy or the unauthorized copying. Then the still on the duplicity of emerging groups, our groupings and interventions, we have to look at the cost, we have to look at the confusion, we have to look at the clarity issues, because we may not have even a clear role that these institutions are playing, because if there's no clarity in terms of the players, there's going to be a lot of wars in terms of power and leadership. And this also brings me to the point of intellectual property leadership issues. Leadership at national, at institutional level, in terms of intellectual property, not political, then the African continent. and the Hippocratic issues that could be underlying there. If we don't have them, we'll have a very hard foundation, and we can't base protection on an unclear foundation. And lastly, as we amplify voices, let us consolidate so that we amplify one voice as African states, because we've done a lot in the past. Most of our registries, because I had the registry of intellectual property, our registration started, the first intellectual property registration in Uganda was in 1910, a trademark, 1910. So you'll find that our registries ran from the 1910s or 18 something. So, and we have worked with those laws and policies. So let's appreciate those efforts and consolidate and have a stronger IP foundation for Africa. I thank you very much, the speakers. Thank you for the opportunity.
Hello. Well, thanks to all the presenters. I'm a French speaker, so you excuse my English. I'm a librarian and AFL IP coordinator for Senegal. Excuse my voice also, I have some problem. On our advocacy for the Marrakesh Treaty, for example, we use always in our presentation the fact that an inclusive access to knowledge is a right, and the right to research are human rights, as said by Dr. Samtani. So we agree. But for me, one of the most big problem is in our people, in my country, Senegal, when people, usually when people speak of copyright, people, even the authorities, thanks first to piracy in musical area, thanks also to photocopying. And for them, no link between copyright and access to knowledge, libraries, and so on, as said by the lady before me. So according to me, one thing very important is that regional organization as OAPE and Union, African Union must emphasize at a high level with our ministries of culture, of education and other on the link or interdependence between copyrights and access to knowledge and development. This will help us as librarians to obtain limitation and exception in our copyright law. Because the lady here is right now, when we speak of copyright, people think they are not a policy of copyright, really, in our country. For example, in Senegal, we have the Bureau Sénégalais du droit d'auteur. But with the change, become with the collecting societies in our countries, we haven't now any office who deal with copyright as a policy, and it is a lack. So I think that African Union and as an organization must make emphasis on it. Sinon, the discussion about copyright policy will be about piracy or will be something very elitist, and it's not useful.
And then to Mohammed.
Thank you so much. Sorry for coming back again, but I feel so passionate about this concept of knowledge and information system because it's the reason why, as Africa, we are where we are, because everybody else made sure that we don't get enough information and knowledge about the things that are happening around the world. So as the professor next to me has said, it's going to be important that when we create these policies and these laws, that we move beyond the confines of patriarchy and capitalism. What I've seen mostly, especially when 1994 came, and everybody keeps talking about the beautiful constitution that South Africa has, but if you really look closely to the Constitution of South Africa, it still feeds in to the very same patriarchal and capitalist system. It's really not doing what it's supposed to do, where it really makes sure that it destroys the system. It is our duty, therefore, as people that are here today and people that are in the policy reform, the legal reform, the education reform, and the cultural reform, to make sure that we sort of destroy or decolonize the system itself. Professor here mentioned a very important aspect of things. Let me make an example. Already a white male has 10 steps being given to him by the system. And as a black woman, possibly I don't even have a step. And an Indian person might have 2, 3 steps. So if you want to change or reform a policy, what do you do with that? So if you're going to say equality, what does it mean? It means you give each person 1 step. So that means you're also giving that white male 1 step more, which is 11 steps. You're giving me as a black person 1 step. You're giving the Indian person who had 2 steps, 3 steps. Is that equality? No, it's not. We need a proper equity plan where we are saying we're going to remove from that white male 6 steps and share it with other people that don't have the steps that that person has. So we need to be in that mentality, not in a mentality of saying, we're creating a policy reform that's going to say equality. That's not equality, because we are still in the confines of the policy and capitalist system. We need an equity plan where we say, you already had 10 steps, and that other person had no steps or 2 steps. So we need to remove a couple of steps from you and give to the person that didn't have. So that then each person has 5 steps in between. So whatever policies that we create right now needs to look at an equity plan, not the so-called equality plan, because that equality plan is still on the confines of the patriarchy and capitalist system. Thank you.
Mohammed, can you please?
I would like to thank the South Center at the beginning and all the co-sponsors for this opportunity and for the fruitful and informative discussions. As mentioned in the previous sessions, many African countries are engaging in a certain kind of IB reform. I'm speaking as a representative of Egypt in the United Nations, and especially at WIPO and other international organizations, and I'm coming from Geneva. So I'd like just to say, and as mentioned in these sessions, many African countries are engaging now in a certain kind of IB reform. Egypt is part of this, as we launched in September 22, our first national IB strategy, which reflects our perspective to IB as a catalyst for social, economic development and for encouraging investment and achieving sustainability. I'd like just to focus on a few remarks when we are dealing as delegates in Geneva with a IP and any other international related matter on the multilateral forum. The first, it's very important while we are dealing with IP or any other multilateral issue to keep focus on our national interest of our member states. And this is a very important issue. And that's very important why to narrow the gaps between multilateral agenda and our national IP policies. And this also gives us why it's very important and much needed for our national institutions to better coordinate and not to act in silos while they are just dealing with any policies, and just to ensure that we have a coherent and one position that we can just try to defend on the multilateral forum. This is the first point. Secondly, I'd like just also to refer that the positions of some countries on the same issue, it may dive from an international organization to another while tackling the same issue. And this is we can find while we are dealing with IP, either in WIPO, WHO, and WTO. Finally, I'd like just to highly appreciate all the support that we can receive from academics, experts, and people here just to develop our positions and just to make it more coherent and responsive to the dynamics and the developments that we can see in different multilateral issues and especially IP. Thank you so much.
So I have two comments regarding preservation relating to one thing that Alan said and then one thing that Teresa said. So Alan was talking about how preservation really isn't a copyright issue, but it's a cultural heritage issue. And he's certainly right, but I think one can also look at it as a moral rights issue from a copyright framework. You know, so often in this, we've been talking about copyright exceptions and looking at it in terms of economic rights, but the truth is most authors, I mean, yes, they're interested in getting paid, but more importantly, they want to be remembered. And you know, the notion that a library will have your work in 100 years, 200 years, 500 years is a very empowering thing to an author, and I think a motivating thing to an author. You know, certainly what I've written, I want a library to have it. I want a library, I want it to be available in the future. And that's certainly more important than any financial compensation. So I think even though we have always been talking about preservation as an exception to the author's rights, I think we can really reframe it as preservation is a moral right of the author. The second thing is with respect to the preservation toolkit that the SCCR or the Secretariat has helped develop. One of the things that's also incredibly important and really groundbreaking about the toolkit is that it is sort of affirmatively discusses and endorses the idea of preemptive preservation. So many exceptions that now exist for preservation, both in the US and the EU and Australia and so forth, and so basically the exceptions in developed countries always talk about preservation, but only for works that are at risk or works that are already deteriorating, which leads to the problem of the exception can only be applied when it's too late, right? When things, right? I mean, if something's already deteriorating, to preserve it then, you're not preserving it in the fullest way possible. What the toolkit endorses, and in its model law, the model language it proposes, it really talks about preemptive preservation, meaning preserving everything before it starts deteriorating. And so imagine again with the University of Cape Town library that burned down. I mean, you don't want to wait for the embers to start landing on the roof of the library and say, oh, now it's time to preserve. No, you want to just preserve everything up front. And that's what the toolkit talks about. I mean, it's basically the notion that a cultural heritage institution can preserve all the works in its collection because in truth, all works in a library's collection are at risk, right? Because at any moment there could be a fire, a pipe can burst, a war can break out. And so, but again, the toolkit really is incredibly forward thinking in this respect. And, you know, I think even though it's not perfect and it doesn't deal with access, which is a big problem, but the fact that it does talk about preemptive preservation, and that amazingly in the conversations at WIPO, there wasn't even any controversy. I mean, everyone said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And it does. And so, but, you know, but I just wanted to stress that point because it really is a very important one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. As you can now see, I took over the moderating role. Viviana just wanted to apologize in advance for she needed to leave for another meeting, so I will be wrapping up and concluding the session. I also hope that it's okay if we go a little bit beyond the original schedule for this session, just so that the speakers, okay, Helen. Unfortunately, not so soon, yeah. Otherwise, we would certainly wrap up now, yeah. But just, I just wanted to ask also, I won't respond, and in fact, I'll ask a different question for everyone, and then you would have a few minutes to respond to this huge diversity of interventions. I'm absolutely fascinated by what we just saw. I've been very procedural or methodological today. I'm not talking about substance, but I think it's important because we saw diversity of individuals, of perspectives. We saw reference to changing structures and the global system at the highest level. We also saw very specific comments on processes at international organizations. We talked, let's say, what we're more accustomed to see in Geneva from a more diplomatic language. We've seen policymakers with concrete policies in their own countries, also highlighting how perhaps some of these other academic and diplomatic discourses, so to say, fail to fully acknowledge the realities of people and the daily lives of officials and etc. We've seen demands by activists, so on and so forth, as well as divergences from the point of view of what's more aspirational, what's more feasible and concrete. I think those are some of the, I wouldn't call them tensions, but just the different levels of engagement here and different topics. So I would perhaps sum up with the issue of translation or language, both in the strict sense of one comment that Professor Tobias referred to, and I would like to fully echo on the importance of not seen as a monolithic, English-based continent. Myself not being an English native speaker, I think I tend to be preoccupied a lot about these issues and how across the continent you have French-speaking, Portuguese-speaking, as well as, of course, all the non-European languages which African people speak and are not valued and not utilized across international organizations. All of that is part of this conversation, right? So I would just ask then our panelists to respond to whatever they want to. We had some more specific questions, but if you would like to also reflect on this issue of translation, or maybe I would say, if you are from the academic perspective or you're from the policymakers, if you could put yourself in the, wear a different hat, could you see yourself, or what would you start identifying? Maybe that's something that we all could try to do here, or at least I'm trying to do, and it's given me a lot of, insights, but no answers. So, but because I have this moderating role, I don't need to do that. So, yeah, I'm just gonna give in reverse order, so we can start with Desmond. Or maybe maybe we don't because you're gonna be shocked.
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to talk. Discuss the issue that you raised further. I rather want to. Something that has been in my mind. Want to actually react or to what the issues Professor Alan raised about, instead of dealing with the issues within copyright, these challenges within copyright, we should actually, they should be addressed from outside. And he used the example of competition law and the patent, he used the example of competition law and patent law, and we saw how that played out in the issue of access to medicine for ARVs in South Africa and the successes that were recorded. Resulting in the drop in the price of those very essential medicine. Now, when we talk about the right to research, for me, it's actually approaching these issues of challenge, the challenge of access to knowledge, access to information. It's actually approaching it from, from outside copyright, but within the human rights framework. This is supported by international regimes, regional and even national regimes. And we see that play out recently in South Africa. The blind essay case. Now, that is, for me, the right to research in action. Because what happened there was for blind SA to simply look at their rights to education under the South African Constitution, the right to science, Section 16, the right to culture, you know, and some other important rights, and view, x-ray the Copyright Act, the Extant Copyright Act, through those provisions and say, look, we are blind people and we cannot even access materials for education. We cannot access materials to even express ourselves, you know, and we feel that the Copyright Act as it stands actually infringes our right. Okay, now there was no exception for blind people, as we know there's no exception for blind people as we know in the Copyright Act, which means that they couldn't even exercise that right as a defense to, you know, a potential or any kind of infringement claim filed by owners of copyright, but rather they approached the issue, approached the court seeking to enforce their human rights. And for me, that is actually a demonstration of how the right to research would work. But taking it further, if we are able to formulate a specific, you know, right to research, it will not only enable them to, it will not only have succeeded in supporting that action, but it will go further, take it a step further by giving them a positive right to, giving researchers, now the blind essay in this case, a positive right to enforce a right to access that information. Just like a copyright owner can enforce his rights to, you know, its copyright as, you know, provided for under the Copyright Act. But researchers will be doing this as, you know, will be enforcing that right as a human right. That is, you know, what that is what I mean when I'm talking about the right to research. Actually, giving us the ability to address these issues, not from the copyright framework, but from outside, from the human rights regime.
Thanks a lot, Desmond. So a big defense of the utilization of the rights-based language here, with also, it's another opportunity for us to make reference to this really landmark case of the blind essay. We had the privilege to delve more into it in Pretoria, so it's good that it's been, referred to again. Professor Caroline.
Okay, so what does one use one's last word for? So much to say, so little time. So, you know, everybody who spoke and said something that pertained to the AFCFTA and its intellectual property protocol, actually, no truer words have been said. I actually agree with everything that was said. I wanted perhaps just to pick up on a few of those aspects and to kind of reflect on what was said a few days ago in Pretoria. So the first thing that Toby spoke about, that being that we need to remember that this is a negotiated instrument. It's not going to look anything like an academic would write it because it's not written by academics. It's an African Union instrument negotiated by African Union states, right? So be prepared. It is not going to solve all your problems. It is not going to fulfill all of your dreams. It will be nothing like that. And that reminds me of what Ben said when he was speaking about the CAB, the CAB. He said that we've spent so much time speaking about the Copyright Amendment Bill that we're expecting so much from it. And yeah, some expectations will be dashed. But anyway, it is still, I think, going to be an amazing instrument because it is negotiated by African states. Takes me back again to Toby's point about Africa, of course, is not a country, right? So I get so irritated on social media when I see people talking about Africa as if it were a country. It is not. And so the diverse interests and positions of all of these states is going to have to be somehow reflected. It is going to be a compromise. And then I wanted to pick up on the director's points about building up on what has been said, right? So one of the key principles that drives the AFCFTA agreement is that of preservation of the acquis, building on what is there. We're not starting afresh. We cannot do that. We don't have the money, the resources, or the capacity. So the vision then, I think, for an IP system on the continent is one that indeed builds on what already exists. Takes on board ARIPO, OWAPI, the regional economic communities, the national IP offices. It is one for all and all for one. We're not starting afresh. It would be futile to do so. And as you were saying that, Director, I was looking and smiling at Dick because I'm thinking this is exactly what we said when PIPO was being mooted, right? And this was one of the big problems. How do things fit? How are the institutions going to work together? Duplication, wastage of resources, and all of that. All of that comes to play, and I hope that the AU member states will see their way through that. I think, okay, then the other thing that Tobias spoke about is the different places at which African states are. And so the principle in the FCFT agreement that speaks to that is the principle of variable geometry, which says we look at every African state, where they are, and where they are going, and we proceed on that basis. And so I think that that also is going to be reflected. I think that's mostly it. There's lots more, but again, it's just the last word for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, yeah, and especially for that very great engagement you just had. Yeah, I'll pass it on to Dick and Teresa.
You want to go first? Don't mind. Okay. All right, so thanks very much. So I would like to thank Mercy for mentioning and acknowledging ARIPO and OAPI in this conversation, because they are, as you point out, regional organizations. They are indeed an integral part of the IP framework in Africa. I also agree that having an IP policy can provide a very good context and guidance for policymakers, and also consistency in their positions in a particular forum like SCC or across other organizations. And I think it's helpful when we see in a copyright law that the law includes some objectives of the copyright law, like to support education or research. And there is one other African country that is amending its copyright law right now, which we haven't spoken about so far in this conference, which is Namibia. So Namibia is drafting a copyright law, and Namibia has some very helpful objectives in the introduction to the copyright law that provides a focus, so that when you're looking at what are the provisions in the law, it provides a reference point as to what, and a reminder as to what you should be trying to achieve. Because what we often see with the development of copyright laws is they are left to the technocrats, and the country might have some brilliant policies, and this goes for all countries, I'm not just talking about Africa, but country will have some brilliant policies on innovation and fourth industrial revolution and increasing literacy rates and increasing access to education. But then the question is, well, how can the copyright laws support these national objectives? But what tends to happen is that the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Culture, whoever is implementing these policies, then hands the copyright law over to the copyright unit or copyright specialist and says, well, we don't really understand this copyright stuff, so you draft those amendments. And this happens, we've seen it in the European Union too. I mean, the European Union has some great policies on access, on open access and innovation and stuff, but when it comes to their copyright policies, then it's very, very different. So I wish that I wish that there would be more, that the ministries would then talk to the copyright people and say, this is what the objective should have, this should be what the law should be achieving. And then, of course, then the copyright experts can draft those provisions. And just to finish, I always remember a delegate from Finland who come at WIPO, and he said, talking about like how when the library communities come, or different stakeholders come to him and talk about their issues. And he commended the one particular librarian who didn't come to him and say, well, this is what I think the law should look like. It wasn't drafting provisions. It would come and say, this is what libraries are doing. This is what we need to do. This is how our work we do our work. So you help us to draft amendments, draft provisions in the law that achieves those objectives. So he found that helpful for him to understand what is that we're trying to do. And so I always encourage the library communities when we're talking to policymakers, we don't necessarily have to be the copyright experts, because they're the copyright experts, but we are experts in our own environments. We are experts in preservation. We are experts in research and how to provide access to those research. So that's how I wish there would be more some coherence between the different units within a government. Thank you. Sorry, that was a bit longer than maybe than I was supposed to talk. So sorry, Dick.
No, keep it short. Listening to the sort of multiplicity of issues that have emerged, one thing that I've noted is in this tendency to say we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to do this. And I don't think that we are in a global economic social systems that allows us to pick and choose what we do. It requires us to do everything. So I think if there's one takeaway from this forum and this session is, as Africa, we have to be engaged in each of these issues. So I think that's very important sort of takeaway. Thank you.
That's great. That's great, and I also like the fact we're applauding everyone. It's not common. I hope that means everyone is enjoying. But these two takeaways, I would agree, are very important. Yeah, how this collaboration can actually be necessary towards those policy coherence issues and the conflicts we've been seeing. But then also, there's just this pressing necessity to deal with everything. So yes. And that would also, in a way, also respond to that issue of can we really decolonize a system that was not designed for us? And I'd say that oftentimes at the South Center, people ask us, we always lose, being very frank, because if we are in the interest of developing countries, which means that in multilateral affairs, typically we will be at the losing end. And even if you're, for the most part, just doing sort of damage control, it still feels much necessary. So okay, Professor Sean Flynn. Yes.
You don't. No. After. But you don't always lose. Okay? That's true. And there's moments when the international system has to swing back and forth. And so in the negotiation of the TRIPS agreement, the WTO TRIPS agreement in itself, one might take as a loss, but if you look within that agreement, there's Article 7, there's Article 8, there's Article 30, Article 31. These provisions that spell out what we call the flexibility, but are really the powers to respond and promote developmental interests within the system. And on this subject of decolonization, I'm not sure I'm an expert in that, but I did study at Harvard Law School at a time when the radicals were in charge, when the critical legal studies movement was at its apex. And we're trying to teach students how to think more critically about the system and how to transform it from within. And one of those lessons is to push each system to its logic, is to take its principles seriously and demand that they be fulfilled within the doctrines themselves. So can you get rid of copyright? Honestly, it's going to be tough, né? All of you have signed up to treaties over 200 years promising that you're going to have it. Could you get rid of all those treaties? I mean, maybe. But what about pushing all the logic of those treaties to their actual effect? So what Jonathan was saying, why must we ask permission to preserve a work? Why must we ask permission to preserve a work? The logic of copyright isn't actually to protect against copies. It's to protect against publications. The genesis of this rule was the printing press. It wasn't to prevent you from reading or copying or researching a book. It was to prevent you from publishing a book, the exact thing that publisher was trying to put on the market. And if you take that logic in the copyright system and say, let's only prevent that, that's what we're trying to prevent. We're living by the logic. Then must you ask permission for a library to make a preservation copy? Must you even have an exception to allow that activity? Must a researcher ask permission to extract facts and information from a book, whether they're using their eyes or whether they're using a computer? They're not publishing a book. They're using it. They're using the facts and information. None of these things were ever intended to be protected by copyright. But unfortunately, we now use this term copy. And we copy things every day in all of our daily activities now that we're doing it on a computer. And so the big industries say, then you must pay. Literally, there was a movement saying when you must pay for temporary reproductions on a computer when you like email things or when you stream. They said you have to give it another license because if you read the text of the treaty, it says reproduction and you're making a technical reproduction. And that defies the logic of the very system. So sometimes the radical part is even just within it. And sometimes, and I apologize for being an American, but sometimes some of the tools that you're looking for have already existed in the wealthy countries, right? So shouldn't we have the right to own our own works when we contract it out? Shouldn't it come back to us as owners? Shouldn't there be contract reversion like is proposed in the South Africa Copyright Amendment Bill? Well, that exists in America. Shouldn't there be fair regulation of contracts when you sign a contract with an individual artist with a multinational conglomerate? There's only 3 or 4 music labels in the world. Shouldn't we regulate those contracts to make sure that they're fair to the individual artists who are negotiating with these multinational Goliaths? Well, that exists in Europe, right? Shouldn't there be the ability to just have fair uses and not have to list every single one of them? But if that use is fair, just allow it. And that exists in the United States. Each of these tools, and I wouldn't say copy the whole thing, pick and choose. But often you can find the tools to reach the various public interests in places that exist. So is that decolonizing? I mean, I think it's critical legal studies for sure. Whether we can overthrow the whole system, I don't know. But you can push the logic of a system for it to serve better your own interests, I think. And often in ways that are not subject to reproach because they already exist within the system. Final example that I forgot to mention. Shouldn't our copyright laws also prohibit unfair pricing within our countries? And I'll tell you from the United States, pre-United States, all of our colonial copyright laws that we inherited from the English and the original English copyright law all had that built in. In order to have this exclusive right to publish the book, you also must sell the book at a fair price. So are we doing that here?
Thanks. Great. Thanks a lot, Professor Sean. With a small partial disagreement as a global South subject, so I need to say it. Absolutely, I think we should be inspired by wherever we see as fit, but we also always need to reflect on ourselves. What's the best approach? Although I would definitely agree with you on the conclusions, at least on this case. Yeah. Grand finale. Yes.
Thank you very much. Sincere apologies for jumping just like that. I think for me, the thing is also not using the words fair and unfair in a manner that does not enable us to even unpack what that means. Because if you're talking about knowledge, I was saying in the meeting in Pretoria, it actually starts with a dream, right, for some of us. And if you then want to buy my dream or extract my dream, and then you enter me into a conversation that says, can I treat you fairly? You know, when you already have sold the dream in some whatever form, like everybody is saying, I think as the speakers have put it very well, which it can be a final product, which is a book, can be any other product, right? But the point of the matter is that it started somewhere at the place of creation. And the places of creation are different for many of us. Places of reasoning are different for many of us. And the negotiation then of what is fair and unfair becomes even problematic because we are working within this international system. that is in itself unfair. We're talking about legislation here, pieces of policy documents that are binding us from a particular regime that is in itself oppressive, right? We're talking about colonization. We can even go back to slavery. And I think for as long as the international system is negotiating these issues within an already oppressive system, it becomes difficult to then say there is going to be fair use at some point, particularly for marginalized countries of certain regions like Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbeans. So that is for me the thing, and I think the United Nations system is embedded within that particular framework. 1945 was meant to undo these things, but it did not. The United Nations in itself is an institution that operates within those paradigms, and I think we bought that at the African Union, and I think the Americas also. So it's that kind of a thing for me that says, why can't we decolonize? Why can't we just undo the systems and redo them? And I'm not talking anarchy here. I'm talking about the fact that we are the people that construct these ideas. We are the creators, and therefore can determine what these things are. Why should we constantly move around these legislations that are oppressive by nature? Let us undo oppression and begin as a revolution that is loving, that is healing, and that is honest. And for me, that's what it is.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your intervention. Yeah, very timely. And with that, I'll give the grand finale words to Sanya.
Thanks, Vitor. It's very difficult to follow that. It really is. So I'm going to be very, very short. I'm also going to agree that international institutional rules and frameworks already constrain the extent to which arguments like human rights arguments can be brought up, and that's reflected also in Dick's comments on the panel and in Tobias's intervention as well. These arguments can't really be brought up. They're less likely to be taken seriously. For instance, and I'll refer here to very technical terms, so for instance, the rules of jurisdiction and applicable law themselves at the WTO dispute settlement system make it very difficult, again, for human rights arguments to even enter the conversation, because they don't even get through the door of the conversation. So I understand the implications of what I myself am proposing. I understand the system and the structures in which, like the international political economy of trade. But this is exactly why domestic law and practice is important, because we can then use that to subvert geopolitical power relations. And I'm so happy that everyone is talking about the Blind SA judgment so much. As the academic advisor to Blind SA, supporting them in their struggle, I'm so pleased to see that first the Constitutional Court of South Africa did not fail the most vulnerable people in society. And in fact, the court recognized the intersections of poverty, inequality, and vulnerability. Children with disabilities seeking education, for example. The court recognized these people, mentioned them explicitly in the judgment. And second, that the court itself and this conversation is doing its job in refocusing on the solutions that don't put us on the back foot, that rather put us on the front foot. We are the ones making the law. We are the ones imagining the law. And so I'll stop there. Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Vitor.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. So I guess this is the end of our session today. I would like to really thank everyone for being here, for listening carefully, respecting each other. So it's been a great, great, great opportunity for myself, and I guess it has been for everyone. But before we go to the reception, so we have a special surprise so that we make things lighter and more dynamic, and especially we have some words by Ben. Please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. There are some words that have to be spoken just before I get to mention a few names of people that made this event possible. Amazing panel. When we return to basics with Sanya and Sean and others, it reminds us that why we're here and that some of the solutions are within reach. I'm not sure if the internal logic of the laws being followed in the United States and Europe can undo capitalism and colonial power relations. Well, if that's our objective, we're here for different reasons. We're here as government, we're here as civil society, we're here as academics, we're here as intergovernmental organizations, we're here as artists, we're here as support people and creatives. And, you know, we have different objectives. And the amazing thing is that we sat for this whole conference and we listened to each other and we had conversations with each other. And despite the fact that we're coming from different places. And now I think one thing that we all have in common is that we're part of a community of people that want to change a bunch of things. And we're going to go on having conversations now about how we can support each other in that process of change. And many people here were part of a process of copyright reform already, but now you have a few more allies in a few more places that you can draw on in a few more ways. And let's try to preserve and reinforce this community that we've created and expanded. I want to thank those who made this thing possible. Kyla, is she in the room? Kyla. She did about, 70% of all the work to make this conference happen. And the rest of it was done by Denise, Teresa, and others. Denise. Teresa and Sean, who made... Are you still saying Kyla? Power! Sean, who placed his faith in a bunch of slightly disorganized civil society and other groupings in South Africa to host a conference that normally might be hosted only by university folks or by government folks, allowed us to do that and to sort of be responsible for helping to bring everyone else together. Thanks for that. And for the funders, Arcadia, of course, who I think were watching on the Zoom call some of the sessions, to Wikimedia Foundation, are they in the room? Where's Ziski? And yep, Giovanna, for providing some of the resources. And to Vitor and the others from the South Center. I feel we've only known each other, Vitor, for a few weeks, but I feel like I've known you a lifetime as a friend. I have a feeling everybody feels that way about you. To Unati and Doug from Recreate, who are other Recreate folks. To some of the support folks, Takura, Kyle, and Charlize at the University of Cape Town, who helped us out with logistics. To the Black Stripe technical team, who made the whole thing happen from a technical and production point of view, Simi and Don, and in Pretoria, Tinashe and Julius and Sedilla, and photographers, Jason, and we have a Cape Town photographer. And maybe we can end for 2 minutes with a little animated video clip produced by two of our young filmmakers, production folks who have been part of this process but haven't said anything, but they can perhaps speak through their video that they put together. It may not be the last word, it may not be the first word, it's another word, it's another, in fact it doesn't have any words, it's just visuals. So if we can spend the last 2 minutes of our conference watching the work of two young people who heard about and thought about the right to research and produced this.